let's wrap up with a kind of a bigger picture
Sure.
uh, discussion about kind of from a societal perspective.
hmm
Why is workforce housing important? Kind of,
Yeah. So I'll go back to that rent burden part of the conversation that I mentioned previously. So housing is such a fundamental need for human beings, right? Our biology requires that we have appropriate shelter. That's not to say that people, die because they move out of housing, but I think homeless populations are at the highest levels that we've seen, as best I can tell, in the history of the United States, at least as long as they've been being tracked the way we track them now. And California is the pinnacle of that, right? We have the highest percentage of population of any state in the any state in the United States. And we have the most just people in the United States who are homeless and who live in California. Some of those folks are on the street because they have mental health issues, maybe they have drug addiction issues, but there's a big component, and actually the highest percentage of growth in the homeless market is people are homeless by default. They're working families, they're working people, they're students, but they just don't make enough money to afford the housing the way it's priced in the marketplace in California and many urban areas now, right? So they just got dropped out. When I said it, they're dropped down the food chain, right? Eventually they drop off the food chain.
yeah, it's funny that you should say that actually, Scott, because my introduction to affordable with a lowercase a housing and what I try to replicate in San Luis Obispo, excuse me, was actually in the 1980s. I worked for a family office that was actually building SROs.
I see.
And they were these single room occupancy, these micro units. They had been done, but they were basically flea bag hotels.
Right.
But the city was very encouraging of these. And this is actually going to come back to your projects, isn't it? Specifically about with this same punchline, if you like. The city liked them, but they wanted them in nice areas. So they rezoned certain areas. Of course, there was lots of uproar about it, but we built these really nice units. Actually, it's had my first contact with Japan was going to Japan and looking at how the Japanese live, right, in these tiny units. And as a side note, when I lived in Japan, I lived in a room 100 square feet, almost 10 years. It's quite possible and in a way quite therapeutic for the mind to do that.
Get rid of your stuff, for sure.
That's a totally, you've kind of shed. You can't afford to have stuff.
Yeah, you have to.
But here's what was interesting. This is what I want to ask you about workforce housing. Was that so? We built these things, and they leased up extremely quickly. They were not like your property, like the UTH model. They were not low cost construction, right? It wasn't low cost housing. It was very expensive because we had to have a little kitchen and a bathroom in every single one of these units. So you can imagine what that cost.
That's right.
But what was interesting was that I actually sold one of these right before the savings and loan crisis. So at the peak of the market, Korean investor actually bought one of these buildings that we developed. And he was the only person that I knew out of that wave of foreign investors of the 1980s that held on to his asset.
Right.
And that's because it was a cash cow. Right. And the reason that actually to connect the dots with what you were talking about was that you mentioned, say again?
Oh, I'd use the term defensive, right? Like this is a defensive model.
Yeah, exactly. During a downturn, right?
That's your point about the micro unit project you describe, is that people basically defaulted to those micro units because they're probably on a whole dollar basis some of the lowest cost rental housing in San Luis Obispo, right?
Yes. Well, and the point was that it was, yes, what reminded me of it was you said it brings, what is there if there isn't this kind of housing? You've either got flea pits or you have no housing, right? Basically. Right. So when you bring
the third option is new innovations like micro units or our UTH model.
Exactly.
And provide a different way of the economic sharing model, right? I mean, that's what allows these units to be, how can we put it? Allows these units to be affordable to these families, or in a micro unit, it would be a single or a couple possibly, right? And it basically, it changes the way the economics work in the real estate project, right? And the pro forma of that project that allows the rents to be delivered that's attainable to these families or the people, the tenant, base that's appropriate for it, like the micro units. Right. And I think that's, to me, the future of housing in this particular arena, because basically the way I see a government subsidized housing or true affordable housing that we've talked about, that's always a limited supply, because government subsidy is only ever so much, right? It's a finite supply. It's never enough. And the demand is hugely outstripping the supply of those units. And those units are great. I mean, I'm hats off to the people who focus on that. I have friends and colleagues and people that I used to work for that do amazing work in that space. But I also say, if we're going to solve the housing problem, it can't be by that mechanism alone, because it's finite, right?
Yeah, and I was going to actually get that. And the other thing that's nice about what you build is you actually want to build it. You're not being, it's not a mandated requirement, right? Inclusionary housing is not being forced upon you.
That's right.
And squeezed into a spreadsheet or negotiated away to somebody else. Yeah. You actually want to build this because you can make a lot of money doing it.
We can, the old, idea of doing well by doing good. We're very encouraged by the social mission of supplying, attainable housing to families, or middle income housing to families. It also happens to be a great economic story, to your point, which is, another old way of seeing it, find a need and fill it, right? The need is for middle income families to have good housing, right? If we want to keep our middle class, if we want to have those people be successful, right? I can't remember the statistic, but there's some huge amount of GDP that's suppressed in the state of California because our housing is so constrained that it'll either uses up people's money to spend if they're a family, and use all your income to pay rent. You have no money left to, pay into the economy otherwise, or people just leave here or don't come here that might otherwise live here because they would like the weather or the lifestyle in California, but they look at the housing prices, they go, no, right? So I can't remember the statistic, but, it was a vast reduction in overall GDP production. And, it's like billions of dollars of suppressed economic activity. And, that's not the only reason to do it. But, if we say that we're going to be successful in our economic, planning for the future, then this is an issue that needs to be resolved. Otherwise, we continue to be suppressed and we lose people, right, who drop off the housing food chain into homelessness, right? That's not a preferable thing. And in fact, if you look at the statistics, taking care of homeless from a government cost standpoint is a very, very high cost endeavor. And in fact, if you get a family that's homeless and get them into housing, right? Housing first is a model that people use. The reduction of load on the government for the cost reduction for that family is massive. And the family is so much better, right? Mental health, physical health, right? So I think the social impact story of this is very broad. And in fact, I say, Adam, that, our UTH model is one interpretation of how to innovate in the housing space using private capital, pairing it with workforce housing. But I'm like, we need, thousands and thousands of more of these innovations, right? If we're going to be successful, particularly in California, where we are so housing constrained, we need a lot more of this. So we're encouraging. In fact, this is one of the reasons that we get out in the marketplace. Now, we think the model is great, and we're going to continue to be fully focused. In fact, this is all we do now from a real estate development perspective, is this moderate income UTH model is our, entire business plan.